The rain hammered Seattle's streets like it had a grudge against the world, and Michael Carter gripped the wheel of his battered pickup, squinting through a windshield smeared with streaks the wipers couldn't keep up with. His hands ached from a long day at the garage, his knuckles smudged with grease, his shoulders heavy with the kind of tired that sank into your bones. All he wanted was to get home, kick off his boots, and hear the soft giggle of Sophie, the 7-year-old, who'd somehow become his entire universe. He was a widower, his wife Anna gone 3 years now to cancer, and the ache of her absence still lingered like a bruise that never healed. But tonight wasn't about grief. It was about getting home to the tiny apartment above his shop, where Sophie would be waiting, probably doodling birds on scrap paper or building a fort out of couch cushions. Then he saw a soggy cardboard box slumped against the back door of the community center, half hidden in the alley shadows, trembling like it was alive. He slammed on the brakes hard, thudding, not sure why his pulse was racing. Maybe it was the rain or the late hour, but something felt wrong. He stepped out, boots splashing in puddles, the cold soaking through his jeans, and crouched beside the box. A faint sound came from inside, a whimper so small it could have been the wind, but it wasn't. His fingers fumbled with the wet flaps, breath catching as he peeled them back, and there she was, a newborn, her skin-mottled lips faintly blue, wrapped in a thin blanket that smelled of damp cotton and desperation. Beside her a stuffed rabbit, its ear bent, and a folded note scrawled with shaking ink. Please give her a home. I can't. I'm sorry. Michael's breath hitched his mind, screaming, who does this, why here? But the baby stirred, a tiny fist curling, and that was it. Every question fell away. He yanked off his jacket, wrapped her tight against his chest, her small body ice cold, and ran back to the truck, whispering, hey, lil one, I've got you. The drive home was a blur, the heater blasting his hands, shaking not from the cold, but from the weight of what he'd found. In his apartment, he warmed milk in a makeshift bottle from a dropper he kept for engine fluids and sat in the old rocking chair. Anna used to love cradling this stranger who already felt like his. She needed a name, he thought, something strong, something that fit her quiet fight. Sophie, he whispered after his grandmother who'd raised him when no one else would. It means wisdom, and you're already teaching me something, kid. Her eyes fluttered open just for a second, and he swore she saw him, really saw him. The rain still pounded outside, but in that moment the world went quiet, like it was holding its breath for them both. Michael looked at the rabbit, now propped on the chair's arm like a tiny guardian, and made a promise. I'm not letting you go, Sophie, not ever. 7 years had woven themselves into the fabric of Michael Carter's life, like oil stains on his work jeans, permanent, messy, and somehow essential. His Seattle apartment, above the auto shop, was a living canvas of Sophie's imagination. Now a 7-year-old whirlwind with wild curls and eyes that sparkled like the Puget Sound under rare sunlight. The walls bore her murals, swooping birds in crayon blues and chalk yellows, clouds with lopsided smiles, and stars that seemed to hum with secrets. The kitchen table was a battlefield of glitter glue, half-finished paper kites, and library books about constellations dog-eared from Sophie's. Endless questions. Do birds dream of flying higher, Daddy? Do stars ever forget where they belong? Michael worked grueling hours at the garage, wrenching on carburetors, patching tires, and sometimes fixing neighbors' toasters for extra cash. His hands always smudged with grease, his heart always full of her. He was a widower Anna's absence, a quiet ache like a bruise that flared in the cold, but Sophie's laughter was a warmth that kept him moving. She transformed their cramped space into a wonderland, building forts from couch cushions and old blankets, naming them sky castles, and insisting Mr. Flop, her stuffed rabbit with one droopy ear, was the castle's guard. Michael made sure she had warm dinners, usually spaghetti or pancakes with too much syrup, and bedtime stories about brave sparrows who flew through storms, stories he made up on the spot to see her smile. He'd fought hard to keep her social workers with clipboards, had come and gone questioning his ability to raise a child alone in a grease-stained world. But he'd won. Temporary guardianship, then full adoption, with a judge's nod and a friend's. Testimony that Michael Carter was the kind of man who showed up. One rainy Thursday evening, as Seattle's drizzle turned to a downpour, Michael wrestled with a radiator that hissed like an angry cat. A delivery truck's headlights flashed through the window. Sophie was sprawled on the rug sketching a new bird. A hopehawk, she called it, its wings spread wide. The doorbell buzzed and Michael found a package at the doorstep, plain brown, no return. Addressed just a faint cedar scent that lingered like a memory he couldn't place. He carried it inside, Sophie's eyes lighting up like she'd been expecting it. Inside was a book. The Sky's Secret, old cloth-bound, its cover embossed with silver birds in mid-flight pages, yellowed but pristine, as if untouched by time. Sophie. Gasped Daddy, I dreamed of this last night. A girl following birds to find her home. I saw the cover clear as my murals. Michael's stomach tightened. You sure, kiddo? He asked, his voice steady, but his mind racing. She nodded, her small fingers tracing. The title, I knew it was coming. Tucked inside was a note in delicate curling script for the girl who carries the sky, and Michael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty apartment. He tried to dismiss it, maybe a librarian's mistake, or a gift from a regular at the garage, but the cedar scent clung to his hands, and Sophie was already curled up reading Mr. Flop, propped beside her like a loyal sentinel. The story was about a girl who followed a flock of birds through forests and storms to find where she belonged, each page heavy with a longing that felt too familiar. Michael watched her read, her lips moving silently, her brow furrowed like she was solving a puzzle. That night, after tucking her in, he sat at the kitchen table, the book open in front of him, its birds too close to Sophie's drawings for comfort. He'd found her in a cardboard box 7 years ago, a newborn left in the rain with only a blanket, a rabbit, and a note that begged for her to have a better life. He built that life brick by brick with calloused hands and sleepless nights. But this book felt like a crack in the foundation, something from the outside reaching in. He flipped to the dedication page to Sophie, who carries the sky in her heart, and his breath caught. Who knew her name? Who knew to send this here? He checked the locks, twice a habit from that first night, and stood by Sophie's door watching her sleep, one hand clutching Mr. Flop, the other curled around a crayon. She stirred, murmuring, Daddy, do you think the birds in the book are real? He knelt, brushing a curl from her face. Maybe they're like you, kiddo, always finding their way. She smiled, sleepy and certain that maybe they're trying to tell me something, and drifted back to sleep. Michael returned to the table, the cedar scent still lingering his heart, heavy with questions he wasn't ready to ask. He thought of Anna, how she'd loved old books, how she'd have read this one to Sophie with all the voices. The book's arrival wasn't random. It couldn't be, but what did it mean? He traced the silver birds on the cover, their wings outstretched, like they were flying towards something or someone. Sophie's words echoed. Maybe they're trying to tell me something, and he wondered if the birds were speaking to him too. He closed the book, his fingers lingering on the spine, and made a quiet promise to find out who sent it, not because he doubted his place in Sophie's life, but because she deserved to know where her story began. Outside, the rain softened to a whisper, the city lights blurring into a constellation of their own, and in that moment, Michael felt the weight of being her father, not just in love, but in responsibility to protect the sky she carried within her. Michael Carter sat rigid in the plane's narrow seat, his calloused fingers tapping a restless rhythm on the armrest, while Sophie doodled in her sketchbook across the aisle, her tongue peeking out as she drew a bird with wings like flames. They were bound for Edinburgh, a city Michael had only seen in postcards, all because of a cryptic letter about Sophie's guardianship that demanded an in-person hearing to finalize her adoption. He'd fought for her for 7 years through social workers' skeptical glances and courtrooms that smelled of polish and doubt. And now this trip felt like one last hurdle to prove she was his not just in heart but in law. Sophie, oblivious to his tension, hummed softly her pencil, scratching out a new creation labeled Wish Wing in her loopy handwriting. Michael glanced at her, his chest tightening with the familiar mix of love and fear that came with being her dad. Fear that he might not be enough, that the world might still take her away. Across the aisle, a woman in a tailored blazer watched Sophie with a quiet intensity, her hands folded neatly, but her eyes sharp, like she was memorizing every detail. She looked polished, not flashy, her dark hair pulled back, her posture straight. But there was a weight in her gaze, like she carried a story too heavy to set down. Halfway through the flight, the woman Eleanor Grayson choked suddenly, her hand clutching her throat, her face paling as she gasped for air. Michael was out of his seat, an instant heart pounding as he dropped to his knees beside her. Hey, stay with me," he said, his voice calm but urgent. A man nearby stammered, "I'm a doctor, but I don't have anything here, no kit. We're at 30,000 feet. Michael didn't hesitate. "Tell me what to do," he said, remembering the CPR class Anna had dragged him to years ago, laughing as they practiced on a plastic dummy in their old apartment. "Tilt her chin, check for blockage," the doctor instructed. "If she's not responding, start compressions." Michael tilted Eleanor's head, tapped her cheek. "Eleanor, can you hear me?" No answer, her lips turning blue. He pressed down on her chest once, twice, counting under his breath, his hand steady despite the chaos in his mind. Sophie watched wide-eyed, clutching her sketchbook as the cabin buzzed with murmurs. Eleanor coughed violently, air rushing back into her lungs, her eyes fluttering open as she gripped Michael's arm like it was the only thing anchoring her to the world. The flight attendant rushed over. "She's okay," Michael said, breathing now. "Keep her upright. Give her water, slow sips." Eleanor nodded weakly, her hand still on his arm, her eyes rimmed with gratitude, and something else, something unreadable. Later, as the plane quieted and the lights dimmed, Sophie leaned over, whispering, "Daddy, is the lady okay?" Michael nodded. "She's fine, bub. You did good staying calm." Eleanor stirred, her voice soft. "Thank you, Michael. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." He shrugged. "Anyone would have done it." But she shook her head. "No, they wouldn't. Most people freeze. You didn't." Her gaze shifted to Sophie, who was back to sketching, her eyes lingering on the silver bird pendant around Sophie's neck, the one left with her in that cardboard box 7 years ago. "That necklace," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where did she get it?" Michael tensed. "It was with her when I found her." "Why?" Eleanor's face flickered, something raw passing through her eyes. It reminds me of something my mother gave me when I was little. She called me Little Wing, said it meant I'd always find my way." Sophie looked up, grinning. "That's what Daddy calls me sometimes, Little Wing, because I'm like a bird who flies everywhere." Eleanor's breath caught her hand, trembling slightly as she dabbed lavender oil from a small vial onto her wrist, a nervous habit Michael noticed. He watched her closely, his gut telling him this wasn't just a coincidence that named that pendant. The way Eleanor looked at Sophie, like she was seeing a ghost. Sophie went back to her drawing, labeling a new bird, Brave Sparrow, and Michael leaned back, his mind racing. He'd found Sophie in the rain with a note, a rabbit, and that necklace. No papers, no clues, just a plea for someone to love her. Now this woman, Eleanor Grayson, with her quiet elegance and haunted eyes, seemed to know more than she was saying. The plane began its descent, the lights of Edinburgh sparkling below like scattered jewels, and Michael's thoughts churned. He should have been focused on the hearing, the paperwork, the future, but all he could think about was Eleanor's expression when she saw Sophie's necklace, the way her voice cracked on Little Wing. As they gathered their bags, Sophie tugged his sleeve. "Daddy, I drew the lady a bird too. It's for being brave." She held up a sketch of a sparrow with a tiny star on its wing, and Michael's heart skipped, not because of the drawing, but because of the way Eleanor looked at it, her eyes welling up as she whispered, "It's perfect, Sophie, thank you." "Michael, carried Sophie's backpack over his shoulder, her small hand in his, as they stepped into the terminal, the weight of that moment lingering like the cedar scent of that mysterious book. He didn't know what Eleanor's story was, but he knew it wasn't over, and neither was theirs. Michael Carter stood in the cramped lobby of their Edinburgh inn, the air thick with the scent of old wood and damp wool, his fingers clutching a cream-colored envelope that had arrived that morning, its embossed seal gleaming under the dim chandelier. The letter was from a law firm, formal and cold, mentioning an inheritance tied to Sophie's identity and requesting their presence to verify documents, a demand that had dragged them across the Atlantic to this city of stone and mist. Sophie, oblivious to the weight of it all, sat cross-legged on a velvet chair, sketching a new bird in her notebook, her stuffed rabbit Mr. Flop tucked beside her, its one ear flopping over like a tired sentinel. Michael's mind churned. He'd fought for Sophie for 7 years, through social workers who doubted a single mechanic could raise a child, through court hearings that questioned his stability, and now this letter felt like a trapdoor under his feet, threatening the bedstein, the pounded life they'd built. He tucked the envelope into his jacket, forcing a smile as Sophie held up her drawing, a sparrow with a heart-shaped wing, chirping, "This one's for the inn, Daddy, so it feels like home." Before he could answer, the door swung open, and Eleanor Grayson stepped in, her storm-gray coat dusted with Edinburgh's drizzle, her eyes catching his with a flicker of recognition that wasn't surprise, but something deeper, as if she'd known they'd cross paths again. She'd been on their flight, the woman he'd saved from choking, the one who'd stared at Sophie's bird pendant like it was a key to a locked memory. Michael's gut tightened. Coincidences didn't sit right with him, not when they came. With that look in her eyes, Eleanor smiled softly. "Fancy meeting you here." Her voice light, but her posture tense, like she was bracing for something. Sophie looked up, grinning. "You're the brave sparrow lady." And Eleanor knelt, her face softening as she admired the drawing. "You're quite the artist, Little Wing." The nickname stung Michael's chest, echoing the one Sophie had used on the plane, the one tied to that necklace from the night he found her. They ended up in the inn's lounge, a cozy nook with a ticking clock and mismatched teacups, where Eleanor suggested tea, her hands fidgeting with a lavender-scented handkerchief. Michael sipped coffee instead, his eyes never leaving her, while Sophie showed her the Sky Secret, the mysterious book that had arrived at their Seattle doorstep. Eleanor froze, her fingers brushing the cover's silver birds, her voice barely a whisper. "This book, I wrote it." Michael's coffee cup paused mid-air, his heart thudding. "You wrote it?" Eleanor nodded, her eyes distant. "When I was 19, for a child I couldn't keep. It was privately printed, only a few copies. I haven't seen one in 20 years. Sophie tilted her head. "It's about a girl like me, finding her home with birds." Eleanor's breath hitched, her gaze locking on Sophie's necklace, then on Michael, and he saw a crack in her polished exterior, raw and unguarded. She took a shaky breath. "I was young, controlled by my family. I left my daughter outside a Seattle community center with a note, a rabbit, and that necklace, thinking it was the only way to give her a better life." Michael's jaw clenched, the room shrinking around him. "You're saying you're her mother?" Eleanor's eyes welled, but she held his stare. "I didn't know if she'd survived until I saw her on that plane, wearing my mother's pendant." Sophie looked between them, confused, clutching Mr. Flop tighter, "Daddy." Michael knelt, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "It's okay, Bug, we're just talking." But his mind was reeling 7 years of raising Sophie, of wiping her tears and braiding her hair, and now this woman, a stranger with a past, claimed a piece of her. Eleanor's voice broke. "I'm not here to take her, Michael. I just needed to know she was okay, that she was loved." He stood, his hands balling into fists. "You left her in the rain, alone, in a box. You don't get to just show up now." "Eleanor." flinched, but her voice stayed soft. I was 19, drowning in my father's expectations. I thought leaving her was love, the only kind I could give. Michael's anger faltered, replaced by a pang of something he didn't want to name pity, maybe, or recognition of a pain that mirrored his own. Sophie tugged his sleeve. Can she read me the bird book tonight? Michael hesitated, his protective instincts warring with the trust in Sophie's eyes. He looked at Eleanor, searching for deceit, but finding only a woman trying to stitch together a broken past. One story, he said finally, but I'm right there. That evening, in their small room, Eleanor sat on the edge of Sophie's bed, reading The Sky's Secret, her voice trembling as she spoke of birds guiding a lost girl home. Sophie listened, her eyes wide, one hand gripping Mr. Flop, the other inching toward Eleanor's. Michael stood in the doorway, his heart heavy but softening. Watching his daughter bridge a gap he wasn't ready to cross. As Eleanor closed the book, Sophie whispered, Do the birds ever find their mom? Eleanor's eyes met Michael's, glistening. Sometimes, if they're brave enough to look. Michael turned away, the letter in his pocket feeling heavier, its secrets now tangled with Eleanor's confession. Outside, Edinburgh's mist curled around the inn, whispering of truth still waiting to unfold. Michael Carter stood in the soft glow of an Edinburgh park, the air heavy with the scent of wet grass and blooming heather, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth as he scanned the tree-lined path for Sophie. His heart pounded, each beat. A reminder of the panic that had surged when he found her bed empty that morning, her neatly made blanket topped with a crayon drawing of two doors, one marked with a heart, the other with a question mark, and a small figure standing between them, her arms outstretched. Sophie's note, scrawled in her uneven 7-year-old script, had gutted him. I don't want to be a puzzle. I want to be a kid. Eleanor Grayson stood beside him, her usually composed face pale, her hands twisting a lavender-scented handkerchief. As she whispered, She heard us last night, didn't she? When we argued about her. Michael nodded, his jaw tight, replaying their heated words after Sophie's bedtime story. His anger at Eleanor's sudden reappearance, her quiet plea to know the daughter she'd left behind. He'd raised his voice, accusing her of abandoning Sophie in a cardboard box, while Eleanor admitted her guilt, her voice breaking as she spoke of a controlling father and a life she felt unworthy of. Now Sophie was gone, and the guilt was a shared weight between them. Michael grabbed his coat, Eleanor following without a word, both racing to St. Giles Cathedral, where the inn's concierge said Sophie had headed, asking for the quiet place with the pretty windows. The cathedral's stone facade loomed ahead, its stained glass glowing softly in the morning mist, and Michael pushed through the heavy doors, his breath catching as he spotted Sophie in the front pew, her small frame curled around Mr. Flop, her stuffed rabbit, her cheeks streaked with dried tears. She looked up, her brown eyes wide but weary, and whispered, I'm sorry, Daddy. Michael knelt beside her, his voice soft. Bug, why'd you run? Sophie clutched her sketchbook, pulling out another drawing 3 stick figures under a heart-shaped flock of birds, but the heart was cracked, splitting down the middle. I thought if I left, you and the lady wouldn't fight about me, she sobbed, her voice small. I don't want to be the reason you're sad. Eleanor dropped to her knees across from Sophie, her hands trembling. Sweetheart, you're not a puzzle or a prize. You're a miracle, and I was wrong to think I could just walk back into your life without hurting you. Michael's chest ached. He'd spent 7 years shielding Sophie from the world's sharp edges, but he hadn't protected her from this, the weight of being caught between two adults wrestling with their pasts. He took her hand. You're not the reason for anything, Sophie. You're the reason we're here, trying to figure this out. Sophie's lip quivered. But you keep asking me to choose, and I just want to be little. Eleanor's eyes glistened. You don't have to choose. I left you once because I thought it was love, but I was wrong. Love is staying, even when it's messy. Michael looked at Eleanor, seeing not the polished architect, but a woman stripped bare by regret, her vulnerability mirroring his own fear of failing Sophie. He took a breath. We're not fighting over you, Bug. We're learning how to be a team. Sophie tilted her head, her curls bouncing. Even if you live far apart? Michael nodded. We'll figure it out together. Eleanor reached out, hesitant. Can I read to you again tonight? Maybe the bird story? Sophie paused, then nodded. Only if you do the voices like Daddy. Michael almost smiled, the knot in his chest loosening just enough to breathe. They walked back to the inn, Sophie between them, her small hands slipping into theirs, one calloused, one soft, the cathedral's quiet fading behind them. That evening, in their small room, Eleanor read The Sky's Secret, her voice steadier now, weaving. The tale of a girl guided by birds to a place called home. Sophie listened, her head resting on Michael's arm, her fingers tracing the silver bird pendant around her neck. When the story ended, Sophie whispered, Do the birds ever find their mom? Eleanor glanced at Michael, her eyes wet. Sometimes. If they're brave enough to look, and if their mom is brave enough to stay. Michael felt something shift, not forgiveness exactly, but an understanding that Eleanor wasn't here to take Sophie away. She was here to earn a place in her life. Later, as Sophie slept, Michael stepped onto the inn's balcony, the Edinburgh skyline shimmering under a rare clear sky. Eleanor joined him, her silhouette soft against the city lights. She's stronger than I ever was, she said quietly. Michael nodded. She's always been like that, even as a baby, like she knew she had to fight for her place in the world. Eleanor's voice trembled. I don't deserve her, but I want to try, Michael. Not to replace you, but to be something. He looked at her, really looked, seeing the woman who'd written stories for a child she thought she'd lost, who'd carried guilt across oceans. Start small, he said. Read to her, learn her favorite jelly grape, by the way, show up when she meets you. Eleanor smiled, a fragile thing. I don't know how to be a mother, but I want to learn. Michael's gaze softened. You don't have to be perfect. Just be there. They stood in silence, the city humming below, and for the first time, Michael felt the possibility of a shared path. Not easy, not certain, but real. Back inside, Sophie stirred, murmuring, Daddy, is the lady staying? Michael glanced at Eleanor, then whispered, She's trying, Bug. We all are. As the night settled, the inn's quiet wrapped around them, fragile but full of promise, like a bird taking flight for the first time. Michael Carter leaned against the doorframe of their new Seattle apartment, the faint scent of fresh paint mingling with the tang of motor oil that still clung to his clothes, his eyes tracing the small garden outside where Sophie's latest mural, flock of birds forming a radiant heart glowed under the late afternoon sun. It had been a year since Edinburgh, since the cathedral where Sophie's quiet bravery had forced him and Eleanor, Grayson, to see her not as a prize to be claimed, but as a child who deserved a whole family. The apartment, a step up from the cramped space above his old garage, felt like a promise kept, with mismatched flower pots lining the windows and Sophie's drawings taped to every wall. Her hope hawks and brave sparrows turning the place into a living storybook. Michael had reopened his auto shop in a new location, a modest setup with a creaky lift and a coffee machine that sputtered, but it was his. And Sophie's art desk sat proudly in the corner, covered in glitter and half-finished sketches. Eleanor had become a regular part of their lives, flying in from New York every few weeks, her polished architect's life softening as she traded power suits for jeans and learned to navigate Sophie's world of grape jelly and bedtime dailies. Tonight, Sophie sat cross-legged on the living room rug, her wild curls bouncing as she read aloud from The Sky's Secret, her voice steady, each word carrying the weight of a story that had brought them together. Eleanor sat beside her, a journal, of unsent letters open in her lap, pages filled with stories she'd written for a daughter she thought she'd lost forever. Michael watched from the kitchen, stirring a pot of slightly overcooked chili, his heart swelling as Sophie paused to correct Eleanor's attempt at a bird voice, giggling. "No, it's gotta be squeakier, like Mr. Flop." Eleanor laughed, a sound Michael had come to recognize as rare and real, and tried again, earning Sophie's enthusiastic nod. The past year hadn't been flawless. There were missed flights, awkward silences, moments when Michael's protective instincts flared, and Eleanor's guilt threatened to pull her back into hiding. But they'd chosen to show up, again and again, for Sophie. Eleanor had burned her first batch of waffles, the kitchen filling with smoke as Sophie cheered. Their adventure waffles. Michael had taught Eleanor how to braid Sophie's hair, his rough hands guiding hers through the tangles. And she'd shown up to Sophie's school art show, clapping louder than anyone when Sophie's bird mural won a ribbon. Now, as the chili simmered, Sophie closed the book and pulled out a drawing, her eyes bright. "This is us," she said, holding up a sketch of 3 figures under a heart-shaped constellation, labeled Daddy, Ellie, and me, with smaller stars marked hope, laughter, and forgiveness. Eleanor's breath caught, her fingers brushing the word Ellie, a nickname Sophie had given her during a rainy afternoon of cookie baking. "You made forgiveness a star?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft. Sophie nodded, because it's shiny, even when it's hard. Michael set the chili on the table, his throat tight, realizing Sophie had named what he and Eleanor were still learning, that forgiveness wasn't a moment but a choice, made daily in small acts like sharing a meal or staying through a storm. They sat together, the table wobbly but warm, Sophie insisting on extra cheese on her chili, while Eleanor recounted her latest attempt to plant marigolds in her New York balcony, only for them to wilt. "You need Sophie's green thumb, Michael," teased, and Sophie grinned. "I'll teach you, Ellie, but you gotta talk to the plants first." The laughter that followed was easy, unforced, a sound that filled the apartment like sunlight. Later, as Sophie brushed her teeth, Eleanor handed Michael the journal, its leather cover worn from years of carrying her unspoken love. "Read this one," she said, pointing to a letter dated the night she'd left Sophie in Seattle. Michael hesitated. "Then read silently. I left you under a sky that cried for me, with a rabbit to guard you and a pendant to remind you you're loved. I wasn't brave enough to be your mother, but I hope someone is, someone who sees the sky in your eyes." His hands trembled as he closed the journal, meeting Eleanor's gaze. "You wrote this before you knew she'd be okay," he said, not a question, but a realization. Eleanor nodded. "I wrote it to survive, to believe she'd find someone like you." Michael looked away, his chest heavy with the weight of her words, knowing he'd chosen Sophie that night not just to save her, but to save himself from the emptiness Anna's death had left. "She's our bridge," he said finally, "between who we were and who we're trying to be." Eleanor's eyes glistened. "I want to keep crossing it, Michael, for her." He nodded, "Then keep showing up. That's all she needs." As they tucked Sophie into bed, she clutched Mr. Flop, yawning. "Can we plant more flowers tomorrow?" "All of us?" Eleanor smiled. "Only if you pick the colors." Sophie's eyes fluttered closed, whispering, "Good, because we're a garden now." Michael turned off the lamp, the room bathed in the soft glow of a nightlight shaped like a bird, and stepped into the hallway with Eleanor. Outside, Seattle's stars peeked through the clouds, fewer than embers, but just as steady. "You're staying the weekend, right?" Michael asked, his voice quieter than he meant. Eleanor nodded, "And every weekend I can." They stood there, the space between them no longer a chasm but a path, worn by choice and time. Michael thought of Sophie's drawing, the constellation of forgiveness, and felt something settle in his chest. Not certainty, but hope real and chosen.